Thank you, Annabelle. That's extremely kind of you. I'm afraid it may go from exciting to rather normal now, but I will do my best. Yes, I'm Helen Neve, Chartered Landscape Architect, Treasurer of FOLAR, and also FOLAR's Oral History Project Lead, aided and abetted by Ruth Shelton, who, Ruth, are you still with us? Who is closeted somewhere in Cumberland, I think. And I would like to say a few words to introduce both FOLAR and our Oral History Project before I hand over to our two main speakers for this evening. As many of you know, but some may not, FOLAR stands for the Friends of the Landscape Archive at Reading. In 2013, the Landscape Institute gifted its archive to Reading University to be held at the university's Museum of English Rural Life. I would just say that the museum holds a surprising range of archives and is not just restricted to England or to rural life. And I think FOLAR sits very comfortably next door to the Ladybird Book Archive, which, you know, diversity is the thing. The Friends of the Landscape Archive were set up to support the museum, to offer specialist landscape expertise, and to raise the profile of the landscape collections and the history of the landscape profession. Our Oral Histories project started in 2018 and seemed an excellent way to fulfill these aims. But in addition, it also enables us to add to the archive and to raise the profile of our profession and the contribution we make to the planet from a different perspective, by recording first-hand testimony from landscape's elders, movers and shakers. The recordings will be made by landscape professionals, talking to landscape professionals, and for the benefit of landscape professionals, of course, but also a diverse range of other interested and/or related groups. Very sadly, the need for this was underlined this year with the deaths of Geoffrey Collins and then John Worley, which led to the preparation of obituaries rather than oral histories. And by the way, you will find some fascinating tributes to and memories of these amazing individuals on the FOLAR website. We trained our first batch of oral historians last November, and although COVID has significantly changed our timetable and to some extent our methodologies, we aim to be enabling our first landscape oral histories before the end of the year. Our new material will not just be for archive purposes, however, but also for our Telling Stories project. And Colin Moore will be telling you more about this initiative later in the evening. Again, you can find out a lot more about the Oral History Project on the FOLAR website. Quick plug, www.folar.uk. But I would now like to turn to our first speaker, Marie Lagerwall. Thanks to financial support from the Landscape Institute, we were able to launch our Oral History Project by funding a review of landscape-related oral history work already carried out in the UK. And I am delighted to welcome Marie tonight to talk about the work she undertook to prepare the FOLAR Review of Landscape Oral Histories 2019. Marie is a delightful all-rounder. She is an art history graduate, a former academic librarian, and then retrained as a landscape architect. She is now working as a gardener, training herself to become a skilled topiarist, and blames Levens Hall for this particular ambition. Marie also has a part-time job in museum visitor services, and she says has a huge affection for personal stories and consequently for oral history. Marie.
Thank you. I will start by just sharing my screen. I want to base this presentation on just a little PowerPoint presentation I've got ready for you all. Right, okay, so yes, Last year, I completed the review for FOLAR, and I've been asked just to point out what attracted me to the project. Indeed, my first degree was in the history of art. I do have a background in academic librarianship, so obviously I'm still drawn to you know, ordering, classifying, arranging things into meaningful collections and so on. And in addition to this, I studied landscape architecture. So whilst I only practiced for a couple of years, I continue to have a live interest in landscape. I recognized obviously that this material, oral histories, needed to be identified, brought into a review, so that you know, they may well, so that the report may increase awareness of the existence of these interviews, but also hopefully encourage you know, landscape architects working today to consider undertaking their own undertaking their own interviews. At this point, if I could just ask everyone to mute themselves apart from Helen, otherwise I can hear what's going on in the background. Thank you. Right, so I'm just going to define oral history, and I'm going to refer to definitions provided by two scholars. One is from Valerie Yeo. So what is oral history? The recording of personal testimony delivered in oral form with purposes beyond the recording itself. We also have a definition by Paul Thompson. Oral history and life stories are based on listening to and recording people's memories and life experiences. Other characteristics that are important to identify with oral histories are that they can be in-depth and take very many hours to complete, and they can be, and I've got an intrusion from a cat here, I'm afraid. I did shut the door, but she barged in somehow. Anyway, so yes, they can be either in-depth or sort of shorter interviews. And they tend to be one-to-one interviews where the voice of the interviewer is quite discreet. So really the predominant voice ought to be that of the interviewee. And finally, as well as an interview, an oral history tends to result in documentation. I now want to play a little clip again as part of this introduction, and this is an oral history that was led by Jill Lever of Peter Shepherd, and the oral history was recorded back in 97. The entirety of it is 10 60-minute cassettes, so we are dealing with up to 10 hours of content. Obviously, I'm just going to play a short clip. It's part of the collections at the British Library, specifically the National Life Stories collection on architects' lives. And I just need to, yes, link to another screen now. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so this will be about 1.5 minutes.
Everything, the most about wildflowers of the field. I said, well, that's my first book too. I went down to that shelf, pulled it out, and I had it on my 30th birthday.
How does knowing about wildflowers help you with plant lists there?
Well, well, I mean, all sounds are wild, you know, and then it doesn't. You have to, no, you have to pick it up. And then the real thing there is that I realized, you see, when I started designing gardens, I didn't know anything like enough about them. I knew 100 times more than people do who haven't studied them at all, but I was still not up in the landscape requirements, you know, I had a small vocabulary of plants, which I knew because I'd grown them in the garden. And I see that great growth of balsam. That's a plant I found in Birkenhead when I was about 10. And it came in the docks. It's a Russian plant. And I took some seed home. It's got explosive seeds. You touch the end and it goes pop and the seeds fly. And I had a little plot of ground in our backyard, which is about as big as that little bit now. And I used to grow things. And that I grew. And it's followed me everywhere. I've had it wherever I went. I've always had these seeds. And if I forget to take it somewhere, it still appears, because if anything I plant is liable to have seeds from that in it. So it was, no, it's really difficult. And you can't say to a student, well, you should have started when you were 13. That somehow they've got to do it, and that's a grind.
Did your students do practical work?
I'm just going to revert back to the presentation. Right, we're back here. So that was a little clip. Perhaps some of you have actually never listened to an oral history before, so I thought we would start with that. On the documentation front, I wanted to show you what it looks like, what it can look like. So again, the clip is from an interview held at the British Library. So you typically get there through the Sound and Moving Image catalogue. Best to go with an advanced search. In this case, Peter Shepherd. Note to the collection has been specified as an oral history. This search retrieves 5 results. The third one down is the one that we were listening to. And you can see, for example, that there's a whole series of summaries for each of the, of the 10 60-minute cassettes. And sometimes these summaries are time coded. The other kind of, written documentation other than summaries can be obviously a full transcript, but they're very, very time consuming. Moving on to findings, I do want to start by, obviously, explaining that there is, unfortunately, I suppose it would be too easy, there is no central catalogue, right, for searching for oral history interviews. You might in the past have used services like the COPAC or SunCat catalogues for looking up material in major UK and Irish libraries. Today, you may use something like JISC Library Hub, Discover catalogue, and indeed, if you visit that, you can specify the document type as sound recordings, but which is useful, but not sufficient for the purposes of oral history research. Oral histories typically held by archives rather than libraries. Obviously, the two institutions are often linked, but not always. So the National Archives catalogue obviously throws up an interesting set of oral histories related to landscape, but we know that that's not necessarily a comprehensive one. And so for the purposes of the project, actually, the searching for oral histories related to landscape had to be sort of take on slightly less formal and systematic forms. Making contact, obviously, with the obvious institutions, but also, landscape architects and researchers that may have come across this sort of content. So kind of a word of mouth and kind of common sense approach really was taken. There was a call to through the Landscape Institute newsletter and the FOLAR online platforms for information from those who may be aware of holdings and collections. Just quickly, back to that thing of, there not being a central place where you can search for this material. This is that JISC Library Hub Discover catalogue. As you can see, you can specify the search as a sound recording, and for the purposes of illustration, there's a search on Shepherd. It does retrieve, an interesting item, obviously, a presentation he gave, a talk of his on water, which is held within Pigeon Digital, and you can indeed follow up that website. and access that content. But this is not an oral history. And that is something I do want to clarify. There is a slight misconception, which I've come across sort of time and time again, which is obviously quite fair, because of the expression oral history can be a little bit misleading perhaps. So an oral history is a type of audiovisual recording, but that's not to say that all audiovisual recordings are oral histories. And it's just quite important to make that distinction. The National Archives, again, obviously the catalogue can be searched, and in this case, I just, as an example, I ran a search on landscape oral history, and that retrieved 9 results, but that's not quite, again, you know, well, it's not comprehensive representation, obviously, of the landscape oral histories that exist in the country. So I started with the obvious institutions, and here some of them are represented. And I did also, as pointed out, contact landscape researchers and put out a call for information. And so I'll just move on into the, you know, to the actual findings now. So obviously, not a surprise, there are oral history holdings at the Museum of English Rural Life, Merle, at the University of Reading. These histories are part of 3 different, well, collections really. 7 interviews were found to be held within the Heritage Assets Working Group. These interviews were carried out within the last decade by somebody called Lindsay Abbott. And here we've got the names of those interviewees. We've got Wendy Powell, Brian Cluston, Hal Mogridge, Richard Flinley, Merrick Denton Thompson, Tim Gale, Richard Hannay, Alan Tate, and Marcella Eaton. Now, the oral history interviews here obviously cover a very broad range of topics. They're on the life and work of these individuals. But there are, in fact, some recurring topics. So obviously landscape education, what also led these individuals to go into landscape architecture, working on new towns, reclamation projects and post-industrial landscapes. There's quite a few mentions of the Aberfan disaster. The garden festivals come up, contact and working relationships with other landscape architects and so on, and the whole panoply, obviously, of topics that come up in the life of a landscape architect. Then the Landscape Institute, within that collection at the Merle, we've got 6 interviews. Now they're from a different period. So these were captured in the 1980s, and the interviewers, well, some are actually unidentified. And then Ian Laurie led a few of the interviews, also Michael Lancaster. They're with Jeffrey Jellicoe, Sylvia Crow, Brian Hackett, Peter Youngman, and Peter Shepherd. Again, a real breadth of topics covered, and you know, a very rich kind of tapestry of landscape conversations and landscape topics. And then a final holding at the Merle. There is an interview with Gordon Patterson by Paula Laycock, College Records Officer at Churchill Archives Centre. So this oral history is not, in fact, looking at Gordon's life and work in detail. It's focused on the history of the gardens and grounds at the college, and these were designed by Sheila Haywood. So that's the focus of that particular oral history interview. from the Merle to the British Library. So I've flagged this, this catalogue at the beginning of my presentation. It's worth noting that the Sami catalogue indexes, there are literally millions of recordings indexed through that catalogue, and 70,000 or so of which are oral histories. So there's loads of content here. Also, the British Library, it's worth noting, has got this Sounds website, which kind of facilitates access into the oral history collections and other collections, in fact, of sound. There are also collection guides that have been set up. So, for example, the Oral Histories of Architecture and Landscape Design collection guide, which is available online too, and is quite helpful. Although landscape design here is really mainly represented by horticulture. Right, so three sets of three collections that the landscape oral histories were found to be held within. The Down to Earth, an oral history of British horticulture. So that's an archive that started in 2001. The aim obviously was to document and represent British horticulture. 44 interviews in all. You could argue, obviously, all of them are pertinent to landscape architecture, but 20 were sort of, identified as most relevant. The interviewees in these, I'm not going to list them all, but we've got Christopher Lloyd, Beth Chatto, Penelope Hobhouse, John Brooks, Sue Minter and Tim Smith, Jan Woedstra, and Fergus Garrett, and again, others. The National Trust Sound Archive. So here there are, nearing 1,300 interviews part of this archive. It's expanding. 9 interviews were found to be relevant to landscape architecture and practice. And these interviews are held with, this is to say the entire archive is made up of interviews with, people who've perhaps lived, owned, or have worked on estates, now managed by the National Trust. I'm not going to list all of the interviewees, but for example, you've got Arnold MS, forester and head gardener on a capability brown landscape. We've got Peter Briers and Jim Marshall discussing historic landscape conservation at Windsor Great Park, and others. Then the National Life Stories Collection, Architects' Lives, that's an initiative that began in the mid-90s to document architecture and the related professions. The collection is made up of, I think, about 130 interviews, 12 directly relevant to landscape architecture. Geoffrey Jellicoe and Peter Shepherd represented here again. So they're quite well represented in oral histories. Obviously there are another 9 interviewees in this collection, and I encourage you to go and have a look at the BL catalogue. So far, mainly profession-based collections and resources, that is, except the National Trust Sound Archive, which is a place-based collection. The other collections found are really, they're also place-based. So we've got Ambleside Oral History Archive, Historic Royal Palaces undertook a project, Hampton Court Memories. Then there's the Living Archive, Milton Keynes, and Talking New Towns. The Ambleside one holds over 450 recordings. The subject is focused on life in the Lake District, but there are quite a few interviews that deal with landscape management practices, and also some with design landscapes of Thomas Mawson. So for example, we've got E.G. Simpson discussing her life and childhood at Langdale Chase. We've got Jack Cook discussing working as a gardener with Mawson. and other interviews. So 10 within those 450 were identified as relevant to landscape. Historic Royal Palaces, that project, I mean, the Hampton Court Memories, that took place between 1997 and 2018 to document life and work, maintaining Hampton Court Palace gardens. They range, obviously, in focus, dependent on what the member of staff interviewed was responsible for. But someone like Todd Longstaff-Gowan is one of the interviewees, discussing mainly the Privy Garden, the landscape restoration, and some of the archival research and methods that were used to inform the restoration. But also, in this little collection, there's an interview with the vinekeeper and the gamekeeper. So it's quite varied. The Living Archive Milton Keynes, obviously set up to preserve the history and heritage of Milton Keynes, and that's through both interviewing residents as well as staff, corporation staff. So here we've got 10 interviews featuring discussions of the landscape and landscaping, and I've listed the individuals there. So we've got Peter Bunnage, Trevor Denton, and I'll let you read the others, in fact. Talking New Towns. Now, I couldn't assess that resource fully because the metadata for the oral history interviews was not accessible, at least at the time of review. But the website is there for you to look at. It was initiated by Stevenage Museum, and obviously with a view to documenting these particular new towns. I've just I just wanted to kind of give a couple of examples. So we've got somebody like Don Buck talking about the Adventure Playground, or Eric Claxton talking about creating a safe town. So, so yes, we've got the Merle, the British Library, perhaps unsurprisingly, and then these 4 further place-based collections that came up through the review. I want to play some more clips because ultimately that's the point, is to hear some of this material and hopefully be encouraged to produce some more. A couple of things I just want to say the Geoffrey Jellicoe one. So they are 2 short clips from an oral history interview, 2.5 hours long. They discuss projects that never actually took form. So that might actually say something about how oral histories can inform historical research, how it can maybe fill gaps that that would otherwise not be filled. Note the balance between the voice of the interviewer and the interviewee. Anyway, I'll just press play.
This was followed by a plan for Sark in the...
Yes, this was, I think, the most romantic work one's ever done. First of all, it was very difficult to get the island to Sark, and then it's an island quite small with massive cliffs all the way around, which has been its natural defense. And it's the only one of the few areas in what we might call the British world, which is self-governing, and they are only responsible to I think it's to the monarch. And so the Dame of Sark is the one who rules it. She was Dame then. She was no longer alive, but the Prince remained. That these 40 people who owned the island and whose families date back to Elizabethan days when it was taken over and divided, they ruled the island more or less. And my scheme, and I can't tell you how much I like the people of Sark. They were absolutely delightful. But my scheme fell flat to the ground when it ultimately dawned upon them that they would have to give away some of their land in view of the public interest, which is normal planning, of course, going on anywhere else in the world. And then we settled at Cheltenham, and when I was building these swimming pools and the landscape roundabout, and this was an ideal situation. And Ben came down, and you, Michael Langston, I remember, were at the meeting.
Yes.
When we met on the site.
Yes.
And he agreed this was the site that he would like. And then we set to carrying it out to see whether we couldn't carry it out. This we knew was a very difficult technical point, and O'Barrett was our advisor, who gave great thought to this. He was a great admirer of Ben Nicholson's work. But it could not be done without risk of it not surviving more than a summer. That is to say that the materials could only be of the cheapest of concrete, and although we got the surface working all right, this is thanks to the experiments with Mrs. June Harrison, who was in my office at the time, and she says she has, in fact, in her garden at Hampstead, got the sample, which has been out in the open air, and it survived the winter up to now. The fear was that this delicate, very, very delicate surface would be destroyed by the winter conditions. And if so, I, as architect, advising this should be done, would certainly be sued by the local authority for giving wrong advice and spending their money.
So I'd like to move on to a couple of clips of a Sylvie Crowe interview. And these are led by Ian Laurie. Again, we're back in the 1980s. Note the quite different balance here between the voice of the interviewer and the interviewee. It's also worth bearing in mind that, well, the sound quality of this interview is not quite as good as the one we just heard with Geoffrey Jellicoe. And indeed, there might have been an issue with where the mic was placed. So the voice of the interviewer is louder and clearer than that of the interviewee, and that's really far from ideal. But it's just worth bearing in mind, especially if you're going to go ahead and record your own oral history interviews.
Marie, you've got
Yes.
about 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
In the Oriental garden is the idea of a garden that induces contemplation or peace and meditation. And I wonder whether you feel that the work we're doing today, creating parks and gardens, has enough of that quality in it, or whether that is sufficiently one of the aims and goals of design today. Perhaps it shouldn't be, but
I think it should be, and it's an interesting question you've raised. I think we're in danger of neglecting that. There's a great deal of emphasis now, quite frankly and actually, on active sports. But as well as that, you do want a place for contemplation. And I think perhaps in our public parks, we ought to be giving a little bit more thought to contemplative places, as well as just the prime places.
yes. It's very easy to say, of course, but how do we do it? What makes a garden that has that unique quality of making one feel at rest and at peace with the world?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I think very often a nice sense of containment.
I'm going to skip the next clip because otherwise we'll take a bit too long. But I will play one from Peter Youngman. I found this one quite interesting because it reminds us of how difficult it can be actually for an oral historian, for the person leading the interview, to necessarily get a kind of coherent narrative, and perhaps there's too much of a desire to get something of a particularly coherent kind. Anyway, I'll play that and hopefully it'll make sense.
what do you recall as your favourite subjects? And what subjects were you best at?
Well, I suppose I was best at what, in fact, the workshop I did our certificate in, which was history. And I suppose I must have chosen that because I had more interest in it than classics or languages. I was no scientist whatsoever and scarcely ever did any, even in the earlier stages.
So, classics and languages were the subjects that took you then to higher education?
No, history. History. No, my last 3 years or so at school, I suppose, I was working purely on history for the certificate, as things were in those days, and for university scholarship, which I didn't get. I got an exhibition. It was one breakdown in history, and of course history is what I read when I was at Cambridge. That followed.
Usually at university, it's not only the subjects that one's reading, it's the other influences that come to bear. Were there any other influences that you can recall, events or teachers that started to formulate this idea of landscape and landscape architecture?
No, none at all. Don't really know quite what brought me into it. There was certainly no outside influence, no person who could set an example or talk to me about it.
You could also hear, I think, hopefully you could hear the sound of the actual tape, and that's kind of interesting because it obviously speaks of the time when this was recorded, but in terms, in sort of pure or practice terms, this isn't ideal. So just some numbers, 97 oral history interviewees were identified as part of the review, 32 landscape architects or designers, that's how they identify professionally, 25 with professionals connected with estate and landscape management, another 17 working as gardeners or head gardeners, 14 were architects, and the other 9, not particularly affiliated to one profession. About a third of the interviews were of unknown duration, so there's an issue there with documentation. About a third were up to 2 hours in length, and then another third sort of went quite a bit beyond that, and we've got that there is an interview there at 23 hours. So I suggest you try and stay away from such lengths in future when running your own project. Now, obviously, the big anxiety of any review or literature review, whatever it may be, is that, is whether you've missed anything. I hope that should anything come to light since and in future, obviously, that can just be communicated to FOLAR. So there can be a record kept of that, and the review can effectively be augmented with that information. I mean, it's surprising that in the National Trust Sound Archive, which is a land-based archive, a place-based archive, is it correct really that just 9 interviews are pertinent to landscape history? I mean, landscape architecture of 1,000 recordings. The National Archives and all the county record offices were not, systematically queried, actually. That would have not, it just would not have been possible within the time frame of the review. So there's a question mark there. Some of the catalogues I searched with, specific landscape architects' names. The list I used was drawn from various sources, but clearly some names would have been missed out. Missed out. So some things might have been missed. There's also a question mark over whether the cataloguing and indexing practices of the institutions that hold these documents are up to are necessarily adequate to help resource discovery. And as already pointed out, some interviews still don't have any summaries or transcripts associated with them. Then you know, that there is an awareness. In fact, it is in the review too, that there are some oral histories out there in people's personal collections, but they don't necessarily come with the permissions that make it possible for others to listen to these. So that's an issue to bear in mind. And then just finally, I encourage you to have a look at some precedents. The Archives of American Art, for example, or indeed the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive. I mean, there's plenty more if you go to the Oral History Society website. There'll be links there. Oral histories is, well, the work of an oral historian is really a very rigorous one. So I just thought I'd kind of conclude with that. The content and audio recording really does have to be a very high quality. The documentation has to be robust. Storage and archival you know, elements, provisions have to be sustainable so that the histories can be accessed into the future. The legal considerations really ought to be considered from the outset. Again, otherwise you could produce an oral history, record it, document it, but in fact it can't be accessed by anybody because the legal requirements aren't there. And then I just wanted to flag the fact that the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain have this year been quite busy on looking at the relationship between architecture and archives. And in fact, tomorrow there's a day-long Zoom event. I think it's the final bit of the annual symposium, and I would attend if I could, but I can't. Anyway, so have a look at that, because it might generate some ideas as well in relation to what landscape architects might do. And that's me finished with this presentation. I hope you've learned something. Thank you.